In the small town of Ogden, Marsh, Iowa, life was usually pretty quiet. Everyone knew everyone else, everyone talked amongst one another, and life seemed pretty simple. However, while talking, there were rumors of an explosion that had taken place somewhere deep within the swamp, but no news was reporting on it, and nobody was really coming to investigate what it was. As days passed during the first baseball game of spring, a resident would wander out onto the field with a handheld exhibiting bizarre and out-of-character behavior. This man would ultimately threaten the sheriff of the town, David, which would ultimately result in that resident's demise. After a toxicology report came back with the autopsy, it was found that his blood alcohol level was 0, even though he was previously considered the town drunk. This would only be the beginning for the town's problems, as many others would start to act strangely and to their own detriment. But what exactly was coursing through them to make the average person turn into a bloodthirsty monster? We will discuss that in today's episode. So I hope you guys enjoy the biological analysis of the 2010 version of the Crazies. And if you haven't seen the 1973 version, you should probably also go watch that. First thing we need to discuss is the earliest sightings that began cropping up across the town. Shortly after the encounter with the resident on the baseball field, more cases would begin popping up of people acting strangely. Judy, who is David's wife, is the only doctor of the town, and she would actually run into the earliest case despite not knowing it was the earliest indicator of this outbreak. One of those recently infected would begin displaying symptoms of repetition, indicating that something in their brain was misfiring. Attributing it to possibly a brain cancer issue or mental degradation, she would send this man home with the promise of getting brain scans on Monday, but this is where we begin to see how quickly this disease takes root inside of a person. After running the wheat thresher inside of the garage, which sends his wife outside to go investigate, she would eventually hear her son yelling and then run back inside of the house. The issue is, though, this was a trap. She would then hide with her son inside of a closet where they would be locked in together. Afterwards, he would then set the house on fire, and while it burned in the background, he was apparently mowing his lawn. Seemingly, he would take glee in the passing of his family in such a violent manner. Later, as David revisits the baseball field out of compulsion and probably guilt, he would then run into the principal he had seen just the day before. Much like the man who had visited the doctor's office, he was in a state of catatonia isolation, until the sharp yell from David, which would bring him back only momentarily. To this, the principal would then begin repetitiously repeating himself that the kids are resilient and would be okay, and as the bell rang, he mentioned he needed to get back to class. After hearing of the rumor about some sort of blast from the Marsh area and a report of people being found, as well as people in his city and town really kind of acting strangely, David would load up with a guide and his deputy to head out and search for something that could be the causation of these issues. Quickly, he found a plane had crashed in the area and was completely submerged. This sparked quite a few questions, like why nobody was looking for it or why there were no reports on the news over a missing airliner. He concluded that the plane must have been forgotten because it was never supposed to be in the air with the knowledge of the public. Returning to town, based on the water supply maps and the plane crash, David concluded that something from the plane was spreading through the water supply and hitting homes by the reports of those who went crazy first. He would go on to confront the mayor, requesting that the water needs to be turned off. Seeing as it's a farming community, though, this was kind of looked upon unfavorably. The mayor told him to basically eat it and it wasn't going to happen. So he went to the water source himself and turned it off. Unfortunately, by this point, though, the disease had already infected most of the area. As things continued to progress in the town, people began acting even more odd. The original man who had turned on his family was confined to a jail cell and began exhibiting new symptoms such as extreme catatonia, bleeding from orifices, bulging veins and arteries, and an extreme rage. After confirming they did in fact put a prisoner transfer request in that was never answered, David goes on to check the phones and the internet and notices that they are completely cut off from the outside world. He then notices a car outside at this point and then runs outside to confront this person. A lone woman is seen riding her bike through the street in a childlike manner, singing, as clearly the entire town seems to be losing its focus, until eventually they all lose their mind. Turning his attention back towards the black car with a dark tint that was not seen before in town, he approached it and it peeled out before David could get a look at who the person was. With this confirmation, David began to become quite aware that something was happening, and quite possibly whoever was in that black car may be in part responsible. And here's where things go absolutely haywire. Quarantine teams show up and begin rounding up the entire town. Those with a fever are considered infected. Those without are placed elsewhere. Judy is currently pregnant and displaying a slight fever as a result. Separated from David, she is forced into a room where other infected individuals are all displaying symptoms. However, the quarantine team did a pretty poor job, and some were still free and walking around. Specifically, in this instance, the principal. As he makes his way through the infected area, no love is lost between him and the others that are infected, as he indiscriminately takes out anyone he comes across until his attention is brought onto Judy. Right before stabbing her with a pitchfork, he's taken taken out by David, and they escape with Russell and Becca. Grabbing a car, they begin trying to make their escape, but are spotted by a military helicopter. So ducking into a car wash, Becca is pulled out by an infected and bodied. Eventually, the car is destroyed as they escape on foot and hide from the helicopter. However, as they continue to walk, Russell begins to display symptoms as he becomes increasingly agitated. It isn't too long before David is able to subdue an intelligence officer after this to get some information. He was informed that a plane in the Marsh was being sent down to Texas to be incinerated because it contained a virus known as the Trixie Virus. This virus was government-made and designed to destabilize a population before ultimately becoming self-limiting. It is a waterborne disease as well, and interestingly, it appears that there are some infighting amongst the government on this, and the intelligence officer may have sided with those who preferred for the incineration of the virus. He mentioned that he was able to help, but Russell's apparent infection is becoming increasingly more present. After taking out the intelligence officer with a shot to the head, David is able to take the handheld from Russell, but soon the tables are turned as Russell appears to take David and Judy hostage on their walk. After a while, David is able to convince Russell he's infected, and he still has enough consciousness and ends up choosing to sacrifice himself so that Judy and David could sneak past the soldiers holding the quarantine line at the edge of town. Judy and David go on to find a vehicle and are successful, but not before finding all those who were deemed non-infected by the soldiers. They were lined up and mowed down in the back of a semi-truck trailer like cattle. The reason for this is actually still to maintain the quarantine, but we will get to that in a little bit. David and Judy take the semi as the radio they found continues to count down. As the town was deemed past acceptable recovery levels, a nuke was dropped on the small town, erasing it from existence along with traces of the plane or virus. However, even though the virus was apparently waterborne initially, and even with Judy and David surviving past the expiration point and making their way to a new town, quarantine procedures will be placed on the new, larger city as apparently they are considered to be carriers of this virus. So the virus is fairly interesting for a few reasons. First, its presentation. Second, its self-limiting factor. And third, its apparent transmission changes that concerns those tasked with quarantining it. So let's get to what we know about it and fill in some gaps later. The virus, when infecting an individual, will begin to alter the brain's functions of this person, though what it seems to be is really just a rabies infection. As we know with rabies, the wound from a bite may be painful or numb. Bat bites typically do not cause any symptoms, and rabies symptoms appear when the rabies virus reaches the brain and spinal cord, usually about 30 to 50 days after a person is bitten. However, this interval can change and vary up to 10 days or more than a year. The closer the bite to the brain, for example, if it was on the face, the more quickly symptoms appear. Rabies may begin with a fever, headache, or general feeling of illness or malaise. Most people become restless, confused, and uncontrollably excited. Their behavior may be bizarre, and they may hallucinate and have insomnia. Saliva production is greatly increased, and spasms of the muscles and throat as well as larynx occur because rabies affects the area of the brain that controls swallowing, speaking, and breathing. These spasms can be excruciatingly painful. A slight breeze or an attempt to drink water can actually trigger these spasms. Thus, people with rabies cannot drink, and for this reason, the disease is sometimes called hydrophobia, which is fear of water. As the disease spreads through the brain, people will become confused and agitated, and eventually coma and death are a result. The cause of death can be blockage of airways, seizures, exhaustion, or widespread paralysis. In fact, in 20% of people, rabies begins with a tingling or paralysis of the limb that was bitten. The paralysis then moves through the body, and these people, thinking is typically unaffected, and most of the other symptoms of rabies do not develop. And this is sort of why you have two versions of rabies. One is known as dumb rabies, which is you move very slowly, you're kind of catatonic, and the other is like rage rabies, which is you're very angry, you're prone to outbursts, you're spasmodic, things like that. We see with the Trixie virus, it begins to follow a similar path in some respects. Catatonia could be related more to confusion, considering they're able to snap out of it early in the infection process, but this confusion eventually turns into malicious behavior. After a person is infected with this virus, it's clear an immune response would be launched by the body. As they drink the contaminated water, the virus would be very close to the brain, perhaps leading to the quick infection rates that we see. But at any rate, the virus moves into the brain tissue, and as I have discussed in other episodes, this can actually lead to brain swelling as it is known, but it's not so much that the brain itself is swelling, but it's actually the meninges swelling, leading to the presentation of anger and bizarre behavior. This virus would also require a much faster rate of replication than rabies does, and may be able to infect more cells than just neurological tissue. And this may explain why it does not take as long to begin exhibiting symptoms. When any pathogen enters the brain, the immune system has limited options at its disposal due to the blood-brain barrier and difficulty actually getting into the brain. Because of this, it will swell the lining of the brain in an attempt to raise temperature and pressure. This lining, as I just mentioned, is called the meninges. The The issue is, however, that this will ultimately damage the brain, leading to the expiration of the infected. In rabies, we see people eventually become aggressive, and we also see this in the Trixie virus. With the lining swelling, this would possibly destroy the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for logical thinking and has a hand in controlling emotional outbursts. In fact, if you want to see an example of this in somebody that actually is living and is not really infected with Trixie virus, look no further than Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a man who actually had an on-site accident happen where a piece of metal was blasted underneath his jaw and out through the top of his head. This piece of metal ended up cutting off the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. Afterwards, he was susceptible to violent outbursts on occasion, despite being a very even-keeled person initially. The same can be said for those infected. As their frontal lobe is destroyed, this leads to the repetitious speaking, as their brain is almost firing repeating patterns due to the extra external pressure within the head, and we see this sometimes after brain trauma when stutters or repeating yourself begins to form. But as the immune system continues to ramp up swelling, this will continue to worsen. Another thing to note about this is it's not just enough to destroy the frontal lobe. With damage to the rest of the brain being done, presumably the amygdala would also be damaged to some degree. And if you have seen my rage virus video, you would know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, you should definitely go watch that next. With the amygdala damage, which is where a lot of fear and panic and actually rage come from, this would be kicked into overdrive, creating a rage in people or even possible hysteria. We see in the quarantine area that some people are seen laughing uncontrollably, which actually mimics prion disease. In prion disease, portions of the brain are destroyed, which can then lead to a laughing disease, as it is known, but it's also called mad cow disease. But as it seems that the Trixie virus progresses, the brain is destroyed in some areas, leading to outbursts of laughing and confusion. In others still, their drive to attack is ramped up. In a particular point, it's interesting to see that even though these people are not operating at a higher capacity and really just more at baser instincts, which are undoubtedly warped by the virus, they also still continue some higher thought, just not morality. In the town, we see one individual running from 3 hunters previously seen in the movie. However, they are not trying to contain the outbreak, but instead are infected themselves. They do not attack one another, possibly due to the bond of friendship they had previously, but this would fall apart soon enough as they begin to progress in infection. They still hunt down others they do not share this bond with, and are even able to still understand what handhelds are and how to use them. The bond can also be seen in others who were punching a dumpster for some reason. Despite the rage they feel in their brain and would without a doubt attack others, they are seen taking this aggression out on inanimate objects rather than each other, despite being located in close proximity. This suggests that the rage begins well before the complete destruction of the frontal lobe of the brain, and seeing as the amygdala is located at the base of the brain above the mouth, this would indicate that this is the infection pathway through the base of the brain case. And quite possibly one of the best examples of human bonds is being represented by a mother and son. After David took out the father of the group at the beginning, and after the rest of the family's infection, they track down David and attempt to take him and his wife out. Despite showing late symptoms, their minds are enough intact to hold on to the original anger and work together to body David, although this would ultimately fail due to Russell being at the right place at the right time. However, the virus has a progression through time, which appears to be a combination of both Ebola and rabies. Specifically concerning the rabies portion of the disease, we begin to see that as the days pass, their movement becomes more rigid and less controlled. With the Trixie virus, this would suggest that the spinal cord and brainstem begin to suffer the effects of the disease as the infection progresses. This leads to muscle spasms, which in turn causes less control of their limbs. Still though, those infected are able to move themselves, just not as effectively. With the Ebola portion in mind, we begin to see severe hemorrhaging from the eyes, mouth, ears, pretty much any orifice they have, they will probably be leaking from it. This is due to the fact that naturally Ebola damages the lining of blood vessels, which causes the body to begin leaking blood. However, we can see on the body, more specifically in the face, that blood vessels are beginning to bulge. So it would be assumed that the blood vessels enlarge, and this does two things. First, it would cause the weaker vessels to rupture. Those in the eyes are fairly susceptible to this, which is why we can see blood red in those eyes in those infected. Second, as the vessels rupture internally, this would continue to put more pressure on the brain of this person as it begins to pull within the skull. On top of this, those vessels enlarging but not rupturing would continue to damage neurological tissue and organs therein. And even still, those vessels would actually be rupturing everywhere. We see in the cornea specifically that the eyes are beginning to turn yellow, suggesting that liver damage is quite prevalent and not functioning properly, and this is producing jaundice. With these vessels bursting in the face also, this would lead to widespread bruising that we see and the discoloration of their skin. And this brings us to the next part, the self-limiting factor. This disease appears to be so lethal that it wouldn't necessarily be a great thing if it continued to ransack the surrounding area and just create a bunch of aggressive and angry infected. From beginning to end, we can see that the Trixie Trixie virus has worsening effects on the body. Mentioned previously, we see that the meat suit continues to break down as time progresses. It is known that you have a peak of 48 hours after initial infection when the symptoms become the most pronounced. You are at peak aggression, peak bleeding, peak degradation of the mind, but shortly after this, the body begins to falter quickly. 24 hours after this peak, people completely bottom out and succumb to their infection. With all the blood vessels bursting, their muscles becoming more rigid, their brains becoming more and more damaged, and their lack of nutrition at all, the body simply reaches the wall and more than likely will go into multi-organ failure. Those still alive would also be taken out by the nuclear strike, but those who were likely initially infected after reaching their end would do so before the blast wave hit them at all. There is, however, something I find quite interesting about this disease overall. It appears to be a virus capable of spreading through water, but it is not seen if it spreads through bodily fluids or if it's airborne. And I would go ahead and say that because it is seen that people are leaking quite literally everywhere during their infection, it must be able to spread through bodily fluids, because what would be the purpose of this? The whole idea of the Trixie virus is that odds are people would figure out what the source was. In this case, it was the water. However, the virus would still be present in those fluids of the body, and due to the up close and personal nature of those infected, I believe it can still be passed along by body fluid contamination. And I believe this because when David was stabbed through the hand by the infected family, he ended up taking out the mother with the same hand that was stabbed. Cross-contamination is a huge issue, and this exposed him to the disease. On top of this, the next day as he makes his way towards the next town, he is still under surveillance and a quarantine for this town is enacted. David is infected but does not know it or isn't showing symptoms yet. This would imply that the body can pass along these fluids and thusly can pass along the Trixie virus. This may be why originally they wanted to incinerate it, as it was not just a virus you could confine to an area, as if someone were to escape the quarantine and containment, then they could infect others. This could also explain why the quarantine team took out the whole town, as perhaps carriers show no symptoms of infection but are definitely still infected. So the Trixie virus was developed by the US government to destabilize a local population, but upon realizing the virus could not be controlled to just one source and in turn could spread to others through means such as bodily fluids or even airborne due to coughing and sneezing, it was deemed too potent. Unfortunately, due to a faulty aircraft, a crash landing would infect a small town that would then go on to infect a much larger city of over 100,000 people, which is why we need the Crazies too, in all honesty. But I hope you guys enjoyed the breakdown of the Crazies movie. If you did, leaving a like helps, and subbing is a great way to keep up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, second channel, and Patreon links in the description if anybody's interested in that. I recently posted a video on my second channel that got hit with the hammer, as usual, but I should have another video out tomorrow morning covering C. difficile and how they are using CRISPR as a way to sort of overcome it. So if you want to see that, definitely go check it out. Anyhow, I would like to thank my patrons real quick. Huge shout out to It's Not a Spoon, our lone astronaut. Thank you, sir. And next up, I want to thank our scientists Skilt and Trey Windenall. Thank you guys as well. And to the rest of my patrons, of course, huge thanks. Your help goes a long way to keeping this channel afloat. All right, so that does it for me. Just as a disclaimer, go wash your hands, keep your distance from one another, stay inside, play some video games, watch some TV, try not to be too anxious. If you do all this and be smart about it, you'll be okay. Anyhow, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see y'all in the next one.